Good afternoon and welcome. Great to see all of you. That was a delightful lunch. I'm sure you enjoyed with me the food, the company, the really interesting discussion about our Benedictine heritage. So I serve as the president of the College of St. Scholastica. I have not yet finished my first year, but it is my second conference, and I got a lot out of it last year and met some of you then. It's nice to see you again. And I want to take a moment to give a shout out to the Sisters of St. Scholastica Monastery, some of whom are here today, who have really been very generous teachers, role models, mentors in the Benedictine tradition, and just invaluable to me in my service to the college, so thank you for that. So my job today is to introduce Father Joel Rippinger, who is a monk of Marmion Abbey, Aurora, Illinois, and he serves as formation director and director of oblates for his monastic community, and as an instructor and faculty staff chaplain at Marmion Academy, which is a Catholic Benedictine college prep high school for young men. He's also active in the ministry of spiritual direction and retreats. He has an undergraduate degree from then St. Procopius College, and he has graduate degrees in history from the University of Notre Dame and in theology and monastic studies from the Pontifical University of St. Anselm in Rome. His research interests are in monastic history and spirituality, and he does have quite an extensive record of scholarly writings and publications, and I did take a few minutes to peruse some of them. Some of the topics that he's covered include Benedictine intellectual tradition, American Benedictines in the 20th century, history of American Catholic monasticism, spiritual development and the call to holiness, and stability, a monastic charism retrieved. And I was intrigued by that particular writing because I read in a reflection that Father Joel wrote on his vocation that as a youngster he could hear the bells of the abbey from his home. And so I thought that was quite special. So today, Father Joel is going to share with us his thoughts on, the title of his talk is, The Benedictine Option as a Component in Shaping the Character of Benedictine Schools. Welcome, Father Joel.
Thank you, Colette. And it is after lunch, so my intent is to have this talk be a stimulus that will elicit your response, much as the book, The Benedict Option, of which, just in case you were wondering, there is such a thing, and it's out and about, was written not to give us a cure-all for the ills of the present time, but to invite discussion on how we can cope with what Benedictines have coped with for many, many centuries, the demands of the culture around us. So, to begin, let's give the current cultural analysis and the historical analogy that are well in place. We're living in a world that manifest rapidly growing signs of secularization and behavioral patterns that express indifference or opposition to religious practices. I'm sure that's not breaking news. So rather than engage in a futile effort to convert or convince those in the seats of power and influence, people of faith are encouraged to move to the margins of society, and there, detached from the forces that pulverize public expression of religious belief, new groupings of the spiritually observant will fortify themselves by living in intentional communities where they can freely practice their faith. This entire enterprise is compared to the historical phenomenon of Saint Benedict going to Subiaco and Monte Cassino in the 6th century, fleeing the moral laxity and political chaos of a crumbling Roman Empire. And so we're supplied with what is now a commonplace term in circles of concerned Christians, the Benedict option, or as I prefer, really, the Benedictine option. It really has its genesis, if we want to be truthful about it, to a very famous book some of you are familiar with, I'm sure, by Alistair MacIntyre, the philosopher, After Virtue, written way, way back in 1981, where he was calling for a new and a different Benedict to appear in the present age to deal with our attendant spiritual problems. But certainly what this gives us the opportunity of doing is developing a renewed notion of what the mission of Benedictine schools can be for the culture of North America and beyond. By reflecting on monastic tradition and the historical framework of Benedictine schools, I hope to construct a possible pathway for educators as they consider how to confront the continuing challenge of a secular culture and its attendant pitfalls today. So, a little historical look back. And I think a first order of clarification on the manner of Benedictine presence is to reject a popular stereotype that sees us as a spiritual enclave, one that is set at a purposeful remove from interaction with events and people of the wider world. Anyone who has a regard for Book 2 of the Dialogues of Gregory the Great, or the whole arc of historical development of Cenobitical monasticism, can certify that the cloister walls of monasteries have been permeable in too many ways to count. Even when the wider society outside the cloister may have been held with some suspicion, safeguards were in place to protect those being formed by a monastic culture from some of the corrosive efforts of structures and people that were antagonistic to monastic practice. There's a revered by some, despised by others, Latin phrase, fuga mundi, flee the world. And the fuga mundi spirituality really never squared with the historical reality, because monastics have long engaged with kings and prelates, with the rich and the poor, with saints and sinners. And the questionable elements of worldly influence, which have always been there, were not so much ignored as filtered through the unique strain of monastic theology, the theology that Jean Leclerc famously coined, the love of learning and the desire for God. You know, we heard that phrase again last night, quoted by Abbot Elias. And it's interesting, Monsignor James Shea is giving a presentation at this moment in that precise tradition, which came out of the 12th century at the height of monastic influence, and is a tradition that we are part of. But a look now historically at schools in our own culture, namely North America. And when we examine more closely the nature of a Benedictine school in its historical evolution, I think there are some characteristics that deliver helpful lessons. In its earliest form, most schools established within the proximity of a monastic community were the equivalent of a total institution. A majority of the students were full-time residents who abided by restrictions of schedule and activities very similar to those who lived in the monastery. In many cases, a student could enroll as what was known as a minim at the age of 12 or less, advance through high school and college levels of education, and in some communities of men, go on through major seminary. Some would comment that such a protective environment was an artificial construct, creating, we could call it an incestuous religious incubator, having the same questionable influence as society's gated communities today. But however one wants to judge the restricted horizons of our educational enterprises early on in our history, we should say, without any ambiguity, that the Benedictine monastic houses of the 19th and early 20th century in North America showed an intimate interaction with the life around them. They absorbed it as part of a wider community they were part of. Immigrant status, ethnic and religious identity, a working class background constituted the makeup and formation of most of our monastic predecessors. Moreover, the apostolate or the ministry of education, along with the Benedictine pastoral presence in so many parishes, assured a day-to-day contact with generations of parents and children who carried from this experience a very distinctive spiritual DNA, however limited that DNA may seem to the eyes of a more diverse society of the third millennium. I want to hopscotch in the history and look at a crucial part of it, and hopefully that will give us a lens that will help us analyze what is a seminal part of the Benedict Option, namely, what should be the extent of our interaction with the society around us. So we'll look at the critical time frame of Vatican II and its aftermath, because that period presents a juncture when the question of how much and what type of contact with the world outside of the monastery appeared with a very new intensity and a new perspective. Abbot Elias quoted last night from the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. I'd like to do that as well, different part of it. And I think it's a good summary of the outlook that was personified at Vatican II. The Church profits from the experience of past ages, from the progress of the sciences, and from riches hidden in various cultures through which greater light is thrown on human nature and new avenues to truth are opened up. One has to wonder whether the Council Fathers would have classified the internet and social media, to say nothing of alternative facts and fake news, with these new avenues of truth. But I think what's very evident is that it was a phrase very evocative of the spirit of Vatican II, as was the phrase discerning the signs of the times. It gives us a real glimpse into the optimism that was so dominant at the time and seemed to be certainly not dwelling on the possible moral dystopias that might be following in its wake. The same mandate to have a more honest and wide-ranging engagement with the world is borne out in the Council's decree on the appropriate renewal of religious life, Perfecte Caritatis, and by the renewal documents of the major monastic congregations of men and women that appeared in the years after Vatican II. The thrust of monastic houses in these years was to engage in dialogue with the strata of the surrounding society that had previously been unnoticed, at least by the monasteries. At this time, too, you know the story. The mission and makeup of monastic schools underwent a sea change. Single-sex schools were giving way to new norms of coeducational institutions. The composition of our student bodies was shifting. Increasing numbers of non-Catholics were now enrolled. Ethnic diversity was also very much in evidence. As Benedictine schools were taking in an entirely new demographic, the monastics were initiating dialogue with non-Catholic and non-Christian groups and programs, and we saw this service orientation become very evident as a facet of what it meant to be a student at a Catholic school and a Benedictine institution. One of the blessings of Benedictine communities committed to educational apostolates in the post-conciliar period was the appearance of mission statements and curricula that promoted a new and better defined Benedictine identity. Many of us know that this is just a commonplace of education, but it's probably helpful to remind some that the very phrase mission statement would evoke a big question mark expression on the face of many monks. I know monks in my community, when we made our first mission statement, just ask, why? They seem to live the life, but we know the benefit of why we have them. And along with them, we had frameworks that were put in place to go about discerning what type of solidarity monastics were willing to carve out as they encountered and interacted with a wider world. There was, of course, a dwindling number of monastics in administrative positions and in the classrooms, But there was also a sharpened sense of what it meant to be Benedictine. By the decade of the 1980s, one detected a little bit of a change, a more guarded and critical stance toward the world surrounding the monastic cloister. Benedictines certainly were not alone in steering through this uncharted land. Many other schools run by religious communities were retrieving their peculiar charisms. Moreover, they saw a need to transmit these charisms to educators who were not members of their religious community. In doing so, they also reconfigured their relationship with the real world and calculated how to transmit values that could stand as a witness to what some saw as the tsunami of secularization. Shift again to what we might call a period of redefinition and retrieval, which crosses from one millennium to another. The landscape of our culture and education certainly began to change. On one hand, there was a renewed focus on formulating an appropriate network of religious formation and Benedictine values for both faculty and students that could be carried into the broader sphere of society. The ABCU was certainly at the forefront of that at its inception. On the other hand, there was an ongoing concern over surveys that reflected a determined decrease in younger generations with respect to belief in a specific creed, observance of religious practices. Not just the Pew reports, but the books of Christian Smith that I'm sure some of you are familiar with detail that with great exactitude. New phrases began to surface within our schools. Hiring for mission, transmitting the charism, safeguarding the tradition, all pointed to the growing concern about how to cope with the changed reality of hiring and instructing non-churched men and women, while at the same time attempting to form them in a monastic tradition that was seemingly at cross purposes with the radically different cultural climate from which they were coming. This is when the Benedict option really began to emerge, roughly 10 to 15 years ago. And it coincided with the emergence of the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S nuns, those with no fixed affiliation of denomination or religious tradition. And most of you have had, I think, quite a detailed experience of how the millennials have certainly given us a great challenge in that. To describe, what is the makeup of the new nun is not to create some type of negative, stereotype, but I think to remind us of how different they really are from the students who preceded them. Their basis of moral decision-making and philosophical grounding is radical autonomy, personal choice, moral relativism. Their worldview is not so much in opposition to a stance of religious teaching or observance as it is indifference to its relevance. And that's the kicker, You can relish the chance to talk, discuss, even debate difference, but when there's absolute indifference, that leaves you rather deflated. The telling elements of such an attitude were a pursuit of happiness, unhampered by the constraints of moral absolutes, a detachment from the collective wisdom and communal institutions of traditional religion. And unlike previous examples of rebelling generations, willing to contest values and practices they considered inadequate to the needs of the time, the nuns did not feel a need to find a common language to debate. The contours of common discourse were no longer in place. We're back to that diminished common ground we heard in our discussion last night. It was out of this unprecedented and unsettling awareness that many inheritors of Orthodox Christian and monastic tradition began to see the need for the Benedict option. Precisely what that meant at first was not entirely evident. it certainly included a sense of an intentional community that would require a set of practices and an overall rule that would set it apart from the secularized setting surrounding it. Its energy would be devoted less to rejecting the spiritually toxic elements of an alien secular culture as it would be reviving elements of a spiritually stable society that had its model in the monastic world of the Middle Ages. And that is important to see as a long development, again, from our tradition. If any of you, again, try to have people understand what the Benedict Option is, how many people have heard of Charles Taylor or are familiar with? Good. If a secular age is, I think, the most impressive single work. It was written just 10 years ago by the Canadian philosopher and just real theologian, Charles Taylor. He documents in just an incredibly impressive fashion how the moorings of this traditional religious culture began unraveling in the High Middle Ages, and he takes us through the Reformation and the Enlightenment up to the present day, and really gives a very good continuity for someone like Rod Dreher and McIntyre. So what about this Benedict Option? What are its possible shapes? There may be, competing versions, but certainly there's an agreement on why there is such an attraction for it. We do need a compelling alternative to the religion-free and technologically driven climate of so much of our secular modernity today. No doubt each educational institution must find its own new and different Benedict. But there are some underlying qualities that such a presence must embrace, and I think it's well to spell them out. The heart of that presence must reflect an energetic and confident community of faith. The reason for such a community is not a flight from reality or a circle the wagons retreat from discouraging signs of an antagonistic world. At the heart of a community must be a space where others are welcome to enter. Enter for what Pope Francis would describe as the grace of an encounter, and what we heard last night spelled out in even more detail, a dialogue that is fruitful and sometimes messy. That encounter inevitably will enlist the resources of a culture of faith and religious practice from the monastic tradition. These resources will serve as a necessary filter of the assortment of technological and religious biases that people carry into our space from contemporary culture. And there are some convincing exemplars of such communities today. The new monasticism of recent years provides a model that is both religiously diverse, with Protestant and even non-Christian communities, who are embedded in the life of the local urban and church environments where they live. The manner in which the Mankewe movement of laity in South American communities channeled their love for the scripture with the ancient monastic practice of Lectio Divina and went into Benedictine schools throughout the world. That was what Abbot Elias was talking about last night. That remains a very arresting example of a practice of prayer that became accessible to a wide array of adults and adolescents. And that's where I do see Lectio Divina as the great unifier. And how good it will be that this afternoon we're going to trek over to the Abbey Church and we're doing Lectio together. That, to my mind, is a very vital and, I think, binding aspect of what any community of faith needs to do for the future. And it's certainly our contribution as monastics to do that. Any community seeking to model a Benedict option cannot be one that disengages from the larger culture. One of the reasons for the longevity of the Benedictine charism in the Church has been its ability to stay connected to a society, even as it recognizes the need to maintain a critical posture toward society's moral failings. St. Benedict, recall, could allow the patricians of Rome, the illiterate Goths, and the barbarian kings to come to Monte Cassino. A viable Benedict option cannot become a cloistered bubble that isolates us from the daily grind of the quotidian. Homeschooling is not the final answer for parents who are troubled by the ambience of American educational institutions. An educational institution that wants to provide a structure and a spiritual skill set, however, that's going to counter a culture that's devoid of religious meaning, needs to deal very adroitly and very honestly with the challenges posed by such a culture. There must be a place where they can be engaged. And that becomes key. I mean, I was thinking, and hopefully this can come out in some of your discussion after the talk, but in his book, Dreher, he spends a lot of time at the community of Norcia in Italy. And I think it was good for him to do that. He also, there was a Benedict Option Conference, no less, at Clear Creek. How many people know of Clear Creek? Clear Creek, Oklahoma is a new monastic community, very American in its own way, but very traditional, intentionally so. In fact, Dreher, he's really at sea. He comes to this conference, and he's someone addicted to his iPhone, and there's no Wi-Fi at all at Clear Creek. And he's rendered helpless, for a few days. But then he begins to see how this is the type of place he really wants to see happen. Interesting aside, Clear Creek has a lot of families that are coming there, homeschoolers and others, that really see this as their ideal place. I suggest, again, maybe I'll relate a personal experience for me. In Aurora, Illinois, I'm very close to Wheaton College, which is kind of the mecca of the evangelical, intellectual movement, and Benedictine University. Both of those institutions, in different ways, have really, I think, given us a wonderful example of how to engage with different cultures, different religions, and they've done it with Islam. Some of you may be aware, Benedictine University has the highest percentage of Islamic students in private colleges in the United States. Some of you remember 2 years ago at Wheaton College, a certain professor got into some trouble with her remarks on Islam. The fact of the matter is, in those cases, you had an educational institution that was engaged in trying to find common ground, and I commend them for it, especially when they have to face a political correct filter from everyone else who's judging what they do. A positive factor long in favor of Benedictine communities, and certainly one that I think we do revere, is stability. The Benedict option that seeks to capitalize on this value should ensure that for the near future, it needs to attract people to its home space and have them continue to see that as not just a safe space, but a place where there is this gathering of people with one mind, one heart, wanting to pursue one thing, which is the truth of our religious enterprise. And that's very different from what I think was our historical tradition, which was more of an itinerant missionary mode. Our founding years, we were out there making new foundations, going out to the people. It was a centrifugal force that was going out from the center. And now I see that we really should be a centripetal energy, drawing people to a center of a stable and structured space. At once, it invites connection with the coarseness of contemporary culture, holds out the promise of values that are in such a short supply in the world around us, where the stock of Christianity has dwindled so markedly. And certainly, we're talking about the nuns, we're talking about the millennials. They are people who lack religious roots and a spiritual center in their lives. Stability can provide that. And for those who live only for the moment, there is a liturgical rhythm of seasons, of sustained periods of reflection. For those who have been weaned on instant gratification, there is a world where asceticism and stewardship teach the lessons of self-restraint and sacrifice. Truth be told, the engine that runs many Benedictine schools in our country today is competition. We're in competition for test scores and technological expertise, athletic programs of excellence, top-flight professors, new philanthropic sources. We also have parents who pay the way for students, stating candidly, at least to people I've heard talking to me, that their interests are getting their children into the best schools and securing the most successful jobs, not necessarily having their faith lives be saved or shaped by a Benedictine institution. And that's where I think what Abbot Elias, in speaking about elitism last night, can connect with his Benedict option. We have to do our best to refrain from that type of elitism, of channeling new life into, not just the 1% of Wall Street, but success-oriented America. The alternative community articulated by Rod Dreher has been criticized by some as a survival strategy, a spiritual tactic akin to American society's Cold War push for air raid shelters that would provide a refuge from the scourge of a nuclear holocaust. I don't share that pessimistic assessment of the Benedict option, but I do recognize that both our monasteries and schools can easily be stereotyped as refuges from the clamor and chaos of the workaday world. I think a more realistic template of a Benedict option is to see the community as an island of welcome and order, where the directives of the rule of Benedict, the hallmarks, are observed. Christ is received in the guest and is central to all activity. That's not just a way of explaining hospitality, it's a way of being Benedictine. The Christ-centered atmosphere of the rule of Benedict must be deeply implanted in a community that expects to shed elitism and foster inclusiveness. Last night, Abbot Elias was quoting Pope Francis, and I'd like to make a few quotes too, but I also would like to remember that in terms of how this world around us was described by Rod Dreher and others, Pope Benedict XVI was really in the vanguard. And I'm not saying that in any type of overly critical way. I think he nailed it very much when he looked at Europe back 20 years ago and began to describe the spiritual barrenness that he saw there. I would link that up, though, with some striking images that Pope Francis has offered to describe an effective presence we can make in the world. Most of you are familiar now with the field hospital image, where triage is taking place. I think it's an apt portrayal of what takes place in a number of our safe spaces. Not unlike the task of the abbot in the Rule in chapter 27, as the wise physician who heals the hurting, we're called to construct outposts where the spiritually aimless can find the care they require. And yes, there are a lot of bruised and critically injured people in that order. Another aspect of the pastoral style of Pope Francis is conveyed by his desire to have Christian communities establish themselves on the periphery of society. Monasteries in particular have never been entirely comfortable with a high profile that is situated next to places of political power or ecclesial authority. They have preferred physically remote areas where their witness is less likely to be held sway by the pull of popular culture. It is in such places where true dialogue can happen and spiritual values be nurtured and transmitted. It should also give us access to the materially and the spiritually poor. Again, perhaps just an example. Some of you are familiar that Benedictine University in Lisle have a couple of different satellite places. One is in Mesa, Arizona, and their campus in Mesa is largely Hispanic, and they have attracted a large number of dreamers, people who at this stage in our life and history are just, they're in peril. But it's a safe place, and it's a place where they can find, I think, the spiritual skill set they need to somehow cope with all the demands that they have. That's what I think we have to be looking at by staying on the periphery. And certainly, staying on the periphery will guarantee that we're going to probably stay pretty far afield from people enticing us too much to come on board with some of the political correctness of our popular culture. A question that lingers over the discussion on the Benedict option is whether the situation around us is as dire as depicted in some of the writings I mentioned. As a monk who's had occasion to teach young people over the course of 4 decades, and as someone who has rather dismayingly tried to stay current with the signpost of our culture during that same period, I must admit to sharing a good deal of the sense of dread over the present state and projected course of our spiritual wellness. Yet, while the indices of waning religious practice and rapidly diminishing respect for religious institutions will probably continue, I do not envision the immediate future as a time to adopt a bunker mentality, doing our best to have our institutions become the equivalent of what the monastic scriptoria did during the Dark Ages of Europe. We preserve civilization as the last outpost. We should remember we live in a country where we still exercise a remarkable latitude for religious and, yes, spiritual expression. We have at our disposal an array of resources, personal and material, from our Catholic and Benedictine tradition that are the envy of many of our co-religionists. I remain impressed, for example, at how students at both the high school and university level sense the formative potential of one of these resources, the liturgy. Think of coming to St. John's without the liturgy. It doesn't appear in course catalogs or accreditation standards, but the manner in which the Benedictine community's life of communal prayer takes on a pedagogical prominence is certainly one of our underappreciated resources. The confluence of liturgical prayer and sacramentality, think just of artistic symbol, do more than we think to generate a true culture of contradiction to the privatized religion and disaffected strains of post-Christian society. Such resources have been in place for hundreds of years, and they evoke a striking contrast to the antiseptic counterfeits that pass for substance in the world of the present. Certainly, the precise Benedictine option we will incorporate into a mission statement or a strategic plan requires an awareness of the resources available to all Benedictine communities. There also has to be a judicious selection of which ones are most appropriate for our particular institution. There will be some that we will find especially helpful for us, others we may not. A few concluding words. The Benedict option is not a flight of fancy, certainly not a spiritual utopia. It is a realistic and hopeful attempt, I think, to cope with the current quandary of spiritual illiteracy, moral torpor, and historical aphasia that have afflicted our country and global common home at present. If there is no new and different Benedict discernible to our eyes, there is most certainly an ongoing tradition of Benedictine education that can be tapped to build communities where love for learning and desire for God are not opposing goals. Again, we need to rethink what is our present and future. If it's survival, then I think we have it wrong. If, as was implied this morning, it's sustainability, with all of these resources in place, then I think we have it right. We should not be flummoxed by the accelerating pace of scientific inquiry and technological innovation. Nor should we devote our better energies to standing on the sidelines and decrying the cheap imitations of religious education and practice that we can all see in our popular culture. One of the saving graces of having a knowledge of history is to know that we have seen worse than this. Distressed as our precarious stretches of history may have been for the faith, the fact that the many centuries after Benedict have witnessed the perduring power of monastic practices and Benedictine tradition speaks eloquently to why our hope should stay strong. We have been entrusted with trying to preserve the integrity of our rich tradition, even as we seek new ways to engage a world that needs the stimulus of both our past and our present. Whether we do that by a construct we call the Benedict Option or by a like-minded enterprise, it must be an effort that is up to a challenging, dominant secular ideology. And it must be one that will keep us challenged for some time to come. Thank you. And now let's get your reaction. There's a lot, of polarization in the Benedict Option, hearkening back to last night. But I do think you can find some very good groundwork for at least looking at the situation we have, which I think we can all agree is markedly changed with respect to the dynamics that are in place with the demographics of our student and adult population. So I am very anxious to at least get new ideas on this and perhaps comments. So it's all yours. Hopefully we can, yes, Patrick.
Thank you for a very eloquent discussion of what I think is a very, very interesting topic. I am just about finished with the Benedict Option reading over the last couple of weeks. And I was delighted when I came to the conference to realize that, first of all, somebody was going to actually address this, and even better, there was you. So it was a great presentation. I have this question both about the book and maybe, I don't know, something that you might consider in your reflection. What about the whole financial aspect of what's happened with Catholic education and, of course, Benedictine Catholic education? There's a lot of reasons for it, but tuitions at all private universities, including Catholic ones, have just exploded, way beyond of inflation for, I think, at least 3, maybe 4 decades. So a big factor that students are dealing with, and the non-students, the NON students, it's just this enormous expense that they have to, finances they have to come up with to subsidize their education. And I think this has a very corrosive effect on both moral and spiritual development. In the Benedict Option text, in the book, some of the solutions seem to me to be kind of somewhat financially naive. I mean, he wants people to send their kids to what he calls the core or classical Catholic schools or Christian schools, or just homeschool. For many middle-class people, this is just impossible. Certainly classical Christian education is very expensive, and homeschooling requires that you can finance a family with only one salary. Okay? So even I think there's a lot to what he's saying that, that we are in this situation where you have an incredible hostile secular culture to Christianity and Christian institutions. How do we try to, create these enclaves of Christian culture without cutting out the poor. Because they can't.
Well, you raised some very key questions, Patrick. It's clear this is part of the sustainability discussion, and I'm sure all the administrators in the audience can tell you stories abounding in how, at the end of the day, it's the budget, it's the bottom line, and you've got to do that in a way that conforms to Benedictine stewardship, has a preferential love for the poor manifest, but deals with the reality that's staring in the eye. I will say, with regard to Drer's book, what was impressive in its own way was his description. He has a lot of people he knows, and he recounts these professors, with pretty prestigious backgrounds, who simply, have made the decision they cannot be living, at this wonderfully cushiony lifestyle in a major university with, all the benefits that is witnessing a culture that's diametrically opposed to what they're doing. So they are taking drastic cuts, taking their family elsewhere, and it's a great sacrifice, but they believe that's necessary to do. The radical nature of how we approach this becomes key, and it has to have the support of the community. And I will say this, millennials get a lot of, hard knocks, but they have, I think, the wherewithal to make some pretty radical choices and not be all that disturbed by, what's in the consequence. And I think we have to tap that part of it too. I wish there were ways in which, again, we could circumvent just some of the necessary evils of being a fiscally viable institution, serving the needs of many, maintaining our social justice position, and living a very clear witness to the gospel. If you know of another universe out there where that's happening, let me know. But thank you for raising those questions. Other comments? Yes, Chris.
One of the things I'm seeing, not in the principal yet, is the students' pressure to the world of the screen and the pressure they're under, that there is no private life anymore. So how do they have a center that the spiritual life can touch? And it's not something that I see there. And I worry about, I just taught sexual ethics, so I'm feeling shell-shocked. And how they can't see the harm they're doing themselves.
Yeah.
And I can't see us following the route of Thomas Aquinas in California. That's not who we are. But the screens and the lack of privacy and the violence of that, and I mean, that takes bullying to a whole new world. And what do we do as institutions to say, if there's anything Benedictine education is about, it's human to human.
Christine raises some, again, neurologic points today, and the impact of social media, and the screen is the operative word. I mean, it's there, whether it's the iPhone, it's whatever terminal they have, and it's something that, if you, those of you, whether it's parenting or whether it's being a teacher, you just know how much that has influenced their lives. I guess, not to just try to find the silver lining, but I'll go back to Lectio. Even my own students, I'm impressed by how they take to a practice that in many ways is diametrically opposed to what we're having with the instantaneous exposure to violence, pornography, everything you want, boop, there it is, and there it isn't. There's this sustained effort to concentrate on a particular text, engage in listening in a very different way than they have before. And first of all, it slows them down. Secondly, it at least gives them a hint Perhaps it's very faint, but it's a hint of an entirely different way of looking at the world and of living in that world. In some fashion, that is what we're about. But I'll just say, it's not, the panacea certainly, but on that matter, which we all know is right at the heart of what we're talking about, the lure of technology and all of its many facets. I think Lectio, and then so much else of a monastic a life and observance and rhythm, is the best counter. Yes?
It seems to me, and not quite 4 decades, but certainly a couple of teaching, that what our students increasingly are lacking is structure and a framework for how to structure their lives in an ongoing way. So, 25 years ago, students would come in and say, I want to go into political science because I might want to go into public office, or I want to go into economics because I want to work in social justice, or they had this idea about structure, and I feel like there's just no structure to their lives anymore. They have no idea what they're going to be at 30 or at 40, or it's just gone. So in thinking about Benedict's rule, I think what was so helpful about that was that there was a structure. There was a way to structure one's long-term life. So I'm wondering, it's a big ask, but is there a responsibility among our colleges and universities to help our students think of a structure for their lives in this world that is better and beyond a new backsplash or granite countertops? Really the ultimate happiness. So anyway, it's a big question, but I think maybe it's the big questions that we're missing providing sometimes.
But you touched, Jane, a very important point of our tradition. And it's one of those resources that, is there anything more evident to Benedictine life than structure? And I can, again, speak very personally, what amazes me for the typical adolescent that I would see coming into Marmion is that deep set. And I'm not going to certainly be running up to you and saying, I want structure. But you unpack what their life is about, and they do want structure. And when it comes, they welcome it. And it is something that they haven't been given in large measure. But they look at us for models of that structure. And I think there is where we may be lacking. I mean, a great sympathy I have with students, we all know this, their family background, the parenting, you wonder why? Consistency of practice, and I think a conformity in the best sense to, true, absolute values come from having an inherent structure. I mean, that's the center to your life, and this is, again, as much as we want to talk about, the hierarchical church and all those, there was the structure present that made things convincingly, evident, and we're living in a culture now that simply sees that as detritus from the past, and I think it's ignoring a real need that's there. So thank you for that. Yes?
Just an observation. You started off your talk by saying secularism, so many of our students is indifferent to religious practice. But then that indifferentism held personally is due to the philosophic things that they're possessing that are actually opposed to it. But they haven't made that philosophical jump. They haven't made a conscious sort of argument. They've just imbibed certain things that they come in sort of already wanting materialism and already wanting, here's what satisfaction looks like and here's what happiness looks like. And so I think your answer here is very true, that the way to sort of counter this isn't by way of philosophical arguments, because it's not a philosophically held position. It is a personally held position that has philosophical roots that we have to encounter them personally and sort of in the life of prayer and introduce them into that rather than sort of let's get deep into philosophy here, because that's not really going to solve the problem. because it's a personal issue of meaningfulness and it's a personal issue of where do they belong for so many of our students.
That's an excellent point. And let's face it too, teachers here, it's never a level playing field. You know, if we're getting into philosophical argumentation in the classroom, we know who's going to win for the most part. We know they but they're so observant at looking at, you know, what is really happening. And again, for a monastic community, there is that, you know, I still say, how do you witness to being a monk? And, you know, I try not to make it sound facetious, but how many meetings I've left, you know, it's time for Vespers. And, you know, some people are just saying, I wish I were a monk. But it makes the point, it is time for Vespers. And this is the day we live. And, you know, whatever we're discussing, okay, you know, we can go on. That's what's going to, I think, perdure. And somehow, yes, that does trump any heady, intellectually convincing philosophical argument. Good point. Yes?
Does our own credibility issues as a Catholic Church play into this? And then I have to say I'm a little bit sad at the tone in this room with the kind of dislike of millennials. I'm a millennial, and I think most of the time I do a pretty good job on things. But it seems like when we were talking about millennials being willing to take risks, when they go through college and see their debt, their life tends to change. Just seeing a lot of people that I've graduated with is that the American dream is no longer possible. So you get some kind of balance of, oh, I might be 90,000 in debt, but I have some life purpose. So is there a more hopeful vision?
Well, I think you can talk with any teacher or administrator in this room and have them tell stories of students, millennials, who have blown them away with an anecdote about, you know, something in the service project they've done, a family loss that they coped with and somehow came up with a number of strategies that made them not just survive but come out to be a better person. We see that, and that's where I think as people of faith we see grace at work. And I do see grace at work. And I think your mention of, the sexual abuse crisis, is that something that weighs heavily? Yes, on all this. But, you know, the other side of that is a certain purification that was needed for a long time. And I don't want to get, you know, too way out on this, but I do think what, for my generation, the millennials have done is have us take a completely different look at how I look at things and how I interpret things. As not just as a monk, as a believing Catholic, but as a person living in the world. And you know, when Abbot Elias talked last night about LGBTQ and all that, I think one of the things I made a firm commitment to do is just try and listen to stories from people, you know, who represent that wing, because personally, I have a lot of difficulty in having that become ordered to my moral worldview. But when I listen to the story, and this gets back to Pope Francis too, is what he encountered, I always come through with an incredibly advanced sympathy, in the best sense of that term, for the people and what they're going through. So, I mean, your point's well made, you know. Who handed you this mess, huh? Who produced the technology? We're all part of it, and I think the more we realize we have to help one another on this, and that's, you know, helping one another. And then we'll go back to the polarization, trying to find the common ground. But thank you for representing a generation there. Yes?
So I have kind of a question. Some phrases I think I've been hearing today, not just from you, things like secular humanism, moral relativism. What I think I'm hearing is that somehow those might be conflated, or conflating the idea that atheists and agnostics are somehow lacking in morals and ethics, which I think might have some inaccurate assumptions underneath that. That's what I think I'm hearing. And so, as someone who has for many years checked the box none, what attracted me to the Benedictine University was such a strong emphasis on ethics. And so I'm wondering what we can do to both attract students and also kind of create space for students who maybe don't have the kind of religious identity that would normally direct them to a Benedictine University, but that could gain something and even offer something, especially in terms of dialogue, if we do want to reduce this kind of polarization.
Well, for starters, people you just described coming into a space where they're not in the moral, viewfinder, and even the actual gun of the people looking at them. Here we are. You're here. You don't have what we have. We're going to set you straight. And I think we all know that what Chapter 53 in the Rule invites us to do is have this unconditioned welcome for someone who may in countless ways be presenting a needed word we have to hear from the Lord. There should be no, dumbing down, somehow trying to reduce our resources and tradition in that exchange that takes place. But the most important thing too is they feel that this is a different space than what they have when they're out there. I mean, a good example gets back to Christine, the social media. I mean, people who even go on social media today, they're just, you need a suit of armor sometimes just to survive, because you know what you're going to get. People should enter a Benedictine space and know that's not part of our package. There's none of that, the nastiness, the antagonism. There's a sense of more than just trying to find the mutual ground. It's this seeing that the whole of God's creation is in some way mirrored in this space, and we're trying to let people know that the kingdom of God is represented here. I think, again, name the places where that can really occur. They're few and far between. And the answer I would give at the end is, we have resources in our Benedictine institutions that a lot of other places with that same intent don't have. And for that, we can be grateful. But thank you, yes. Other questions or comments? A lot of good points here. Yeah. Yes?
So, the two things that I'm focusing on in my mind, how to balance the idea of being on the periphery and setting up a safe space while still being engaged with the broader society. And how does that balance, how do we translate that balance into something that our students can understand and take with them when they leave a monastic?
Such a simple task, huh?
I am a philosopher, and I think we need to start with philosophy. But I don't want to teach my students how to be philosophy professors. I want to prepare them to do whatever they want to do. So even as we make sure we have the right set of characteristics, we're not sending our students out to form new monasteries. Right? We're sending them out for what? I'm not even sure.
The philosopher has just helped us. What are we sending our students out to do? And I would say that should be in the forefront of all that we say and do. And not as, again, I'm going to go back to last night, proselytizing, not as giving my agenda full voice and exposing students to that and nothing else, but to just have confidence, and this is my response really, have full confidence that in this particular environment of monastic school, for want of a better term, grace will be operative, and our students will be given those things that they need with our use of our gifts. As a philosopher, you can do that in your own way. The agnostic physics teacher can do it in his or her own way. And I think there has to be just that common orientation of, we see that we are in a long tradition of truth and wisdom teaching, and we have to be doing it in the most effective way we can. And there's a lot of room for difference in that. Benedict would allow for it. But yeah, we shouldn't be packaging it up too neatly. And we should there are going to be some loose ends. Well, there always are loose ends. Yeah. Yes.
How do you suggest we handle the situation with the split in our own church, and these students who have departed from the church because they see it outdated, and how do we get them to see that the values of our faith have more relevance probably to the 21st century than they ever have had before? How do we apply the Beatitudes to the problems in the world today, and using all the modern methods and technology and everything, how do we get them to see that their faith has really true relevance to our society now, instead of just dismissing it as outdated?
Well, part of it is using the methods of today. And if we're Benedictines in heart, we have to have that built-in Benedictine temper that is always listening deeply to what the needs are and respond to those needs and be willing to change. I think, as much as we talk about structure and stability and studying this, we're here after 1,500 some years because we've changed when we needed to. And that's not just some type of fine-tuning. Sometimes it requires some real tough, wrenching change. And I think when students see us do that, they know we're in it for real. If they see, someone is coming out of a comfortable, cushiony existence, giving them what they see as bromides from another distant past, it's not going to do much at all, no matter how sincere we might be. So, fundamentally, are we willing to change in the sense of finding new ways and new methods? And still, be able to know well what the needs are. At least from my point of view, there is just an elemental sense of giving them a core set of values that they simply don't have, students of the day. And it's not, these are not my values I'm giving to you. These are timeless values that you can incorporate and find applicable in your own way, but you need to have them. And maybe a last thing, I think we have to tell our story and tell some of the difficulty we've had. And tell some of our rebellious side when we were coming to realize who we were and what our faith was.
Yes.
There's a really interesting text called "This Is Water," and it's by David Foster Wallace, who actually committed suicide, but as an English professor, one of, I think, our greatest writers. And he wrote this commencement speech, the only one he ever wrote, called "This Is Water." And in it he said, I'm paraphrasing, but there are about 2 or 3 things that you can devote your life to that won't eat you alive. And religion is one of them, right? So, here's somebody who's secular, who after a lifetime of thinking through issues is saying to a group of college kids, the religious tradition, the Christian religious, well, I would think he would probably broaden it, but the religious tradition as it has been practiced probably by Jews and by Christians over, hundreds and hundreds of years is one that will not eat you alive. And I think that's a nice metaphor to say to students, this is a path that will let you live your life that is worthwhile. It's a nice.
Yes.
To go along with that, though, too, coming from the millennial generation, you also have to approach students with a faith background. You may have departed, or even those that have no faith background. You have to approach it from a one-on-one level. You have to reach them on that fundamental, level. I've equated to my own experience in Mesa, Arizona, moving from the Midwest for 26 years of my life, trying to find a parish out there, going to different priests and hearing their homilies, and it wasn't really connected. Ended up going to ASU Newman Center with Father Rob Clemens, who, a fantastic guy, but his homilies reach you on a personal level, one that you can take out into everyday life and actually act out. And it goes the same at a school. You have to be able to reach those kids on an individual level, not judge them, not take them out of their element too much, but, gently lead them in the right direction. If you force feed it, or if you try and overextend them, it's just not going to work. You have to, reach them on that personal, humane level, and then, gently guide them without trying to, fast track it, so to say.
Yes, no?
I wanted to say, we're talking about millennials, but our current freshmen are Generation Z. And there's been a shift there too, so, and I love them. I tell them, you're jaded, nothing can shock you. They're jaded. And I love it because they're not afraid to talk about anything. They have no inhibitions. It's fantastic, So, and then there are other characteristics with Generation Z too. And the whole thing about evangelizing, the last several popes evangelized by attraction. And either we got it or we don't. And they can see through our hypocrisy. They have a phony detector that can sniff it out a mile away. And so we need to listen to what they have to say.
And that's a plus too. I can speak from experience. Things I never could get by talking about in class years ago. Now it's all right there, and yeah. So good. Thank you for the last one there. Okay, Peggy.
I was just going to say just something that he said, and this little phrase has been going through my mind all through your talk. In order for something like this to work, you've got to look in the mirror, and just, if people are not responding, why aren't they? Like you said, it's by law of attraction that people are drawn in. So we have to reevaluate and keep, go back to basics. Keep it simple, not, just live your life. Don't worry about what they're doing as much as what you're doing, because that's reflecting to them. And, there's just so, at that age you're like sponges and they're watching everything you do. If they're watching everything you do, and like you said, you see a lot of hypocrisy, well, no wonder, they're going off in a different direction. So.
Thank you. Colette, you want to give us a little reminder about Lifefield?
I just wanted to say that I was told, must end by 2:30. So I'm trying to stay on track, but this is a very engaging and enriching discussion, and we'll be here for quite some time. But please join me in thanking Father. And the last bit of housekeeping is next session, Lectio Divina, begins at 3 p.m. in St. John's Abbey Church in Abbott, Nashville.